So it's having worked with Jason at the very beginning when these ideas were being fleshed out in the school, hadn't yet formed, and then having the opportunity to be here 3 times this year, to work with the teachers, to be in classrooms. It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce these ideas to you and to talk more about how we can work together as educators, as teachers, as parents, to help make students really powerful thinkers and learners. So this evening I've kind of organized my talk around kind of 3 big questions that I want to explore with you. And the first one is thinking about why it is that we need to actually transform our schools and why a culture of thinking matters, why that's an important component of what education means today. And the second is to kind of understand that what are the key practices involved. And when I talk about a culture of thinking, I'm not only talking about schools and classrooms, but cultures of thinking exist anytime a group of people come together where learning is a part of what they do. So a culture of thinking can be a family unit, a culture of thinking can be a business group, a committee, many different groups that we belong to, we could classify as cultures of thinking. And the last thing that I want to end with, a question to explore, is to talk about some practices, some things that you can do as parents to help make your child's thinking more visible. And that first book, Intellectual Character, did come from work in classrooms. And one of the things that's kind of been, a hallmark of my research is to study best practice. And so I spent a year in classrooms where teachers were really adept at getting kids to think, developing their dispositions, their habits of mind, to study them and what they were doing. And that's where the idea of culture really became important for me, because I noticed that what these teachers did was they never taught thinking skills. Instead, they really leveraged the culture and they used routines and structures that supported their thinking. And so we took those ideas, we developed them further in some work in Sweden, then in Australia, and more recently doing some work in the state of Michigan. And that work was funded, originally was funded by Dow Chemical. And at the outset, I had the opportunity to meet the CEO of Dow Chemical. And she said, you know, here at Dow Chemical, we have an internship program. We get the absolute best and brightest chemistry students. They've all taken AP chemistry, they all have the top scores. But she said, we've noticed something. Over the past few years, we noticed we give these young people a problem to solve, and it's not too long before they give up. And they come to us and they ask, well, what's the answer? And we have to explain to them. In the real world of chemistry, you don't work on problems you know the answer to. So she said, as important as it is for kids to know content, and certainly we want them to know chemistry, it's not enough. They need to be able to think. They need to be able to problem solve. They need to persevere. They need to have tenacity. They need to be able to collaborate with other people. So they were very interested. They felt that schools had actually gone too far in focusing on testing as the sole outcome of education and thinking that we don't need to make this trade-off between either we train kids for tests or we teach them thinking, that those two should be able to exist side by side. So I'd like to show you what, to my mind, is the most fundamental question in education that I think that educators, I think Arne Duncan, I think policymakers across the world really need to be asking themselves, and that we need to be asking ourselves this question as parents. And the question is, what do we want the children we teach to be like as adults? So we are always concerned with outcomes in education, but this is a question about outcomes. It's just a different kind of outcome. It's a more far-reaching outcome. And in answering that question, many schools don't even ask themselves that question. Different schools have different responses to that. But here at IVA, the answer to that question are the 9 virtues. And Jason mentioned earlier that sometimes we refer to those as dispositions. But my favorite way of talking about these qualities, whether they be those particular 9 or whether they be another collection, comes from Ted Sizer, who had been the dean at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He also started the Coalition of Essential Schools. And he used to talk about these things as the residuals of education. And I think it's a really powerful framing, because if you remember from your long division, a residual is what's left over when you divide. after everything's been done, what is it that's left behind? So for us to think about, what is it that's left behind after students have left the school? 2 years out, 3 years out, 5 years out, what is it that's going to stay with them? And to my mind, that is the mark of a quality education. What is it that stays with students for the long run, not for the short term? So if we care about these kinds of dispositions, if we care about the residuals, the long term, the next kind of logical question we have to ask ourselves is, well, so how are we going to get there? How are we going to develop those dispositions? How are we going to develop those virtues? And the short answer to that, I think, is enculturation. Now, I've been accused of making that word up. Some people insist they can't spell check that word, but you can see in the middle the word culture there. And enculturation means to learn through the culture. But my favorite way of kind of describing what that word means comes from a quote from the Russian psychologist Vygotsky. And one of his most famous quotes is, "Children grow into the intellectual life around them." And I think that just kind of beautifully captures what enculturation means. Students are going to pick up these intellectual virtues by being surrounded by them, by being reinforced both in the home as well as in the school. Cultural thinking are places in which a group's collective as well as individual thinking is valued, it's visible, it's actively promoted as part of the regular day-to-day experience of all group members. So a couple of things just to point out about that. So you see there in which a group's collective as well as individual thinking. So this dynamic interplay between the group and the individual. It's not about having the individual think like everyone else, but it's about using the group to support us, to advance us, to challenge us, and working out ideas together collectively so we accomplish more and do better thinking in a supportive environment. And then 3 key actions that I want to explore with you: what it means to value thinking, what it means to make it visible, and what it means to actively promote it. And then the last part, the idea that this is part of the day-to-day experience, that this isn't one-off, we aren't kind of squeezing it in on a few lessons every now and then, but this is really a part of what we do when we create a culture of thinking, making it a part of every classroom, every experience for students. And the last thing, kind of all group members. There was a time in the US where thinking was for this special group of kids that were sent down the hall to a special room to do thinking down there. And we now recognize that thinking is really for everyone, and it's a necessary part of learning. One of the things my colleague David Perkins says is that learning is a consequence of thinking. So we can't separate those two. If we want to learn, we have to think. And we want students to recognize that, and we want that to, again, be a hallmark of our classrooms. So I'm going to talk about those kind of 3 key actions there: valued, visible, and actively promoted. So when we talk about what kind of thinking we value, there are many ways that we might answer that. And one of the ways that we did that as a research team was we said, well, one of the ways that we might address that is the kind of thinking that seems really important and necessary to the development of understanding. That's the kind of thinking that we really value in schools. And so early on, we sat down and we thought about, well, what kinds of thinking seem to be necessary for understanding? And we identified 8, what we call 8 thinking moves. And we put them together and we call this the understanding map. And so our test was, could you say you had understanding of something if you haven't done these kinds of thinking? So for example, could you say you had understanding if you aren't able to describe the various parts and pieces and aspects of something? We said, no, that was really necessary. And in fact, one way that you can think about what expertise is that expertise is actually kind of growing your vision to be able to notice and describe and to see new things. So far from being simple, noticing and describing and recognizing are really important skills to develop. Raising questions, not just at the beginning, but also throughout our inquiry, is really important to our understanding because it not only propels our learning, but it's also an indicator of where we're at in our understanding. And then the idea of looking at different viewpoints and making connections and building explanations all seem very, very central to the idea of understanding that if you haven't made connections and looked at how things connect within the subject area, across subject areas to other parts of life, we'd say that our understanding was weak. If we haven't looked at it from different viewpoints, different perspectives, we also might question the depth of our understanding. And a key part of understanding is building those explanations, building those interpretations, building those theories. And all of that happens as we are reasoning with evidence and supporting our thinking, supporting our ideas, supporting our explanations. And then we thought about the importance of uncovering complexity, because if you really understand something, you want to make sure that you aren't just skimming the surface. So you want to kind of check and make sure that you've gone deeply. And finally, the idea of being able to kind of capture the heart, distill the essence to say, well, what is this really all about? That seemed very necessary. So we said that these 8 thinking moves were really important and necessary for understanding. And as parents, we're always trying to think about, well, how is it that we can be of help? And recognizing that, again, that learning is a consequence of thinking. So to help your child think through, like, is this a time where I can help them make connections, or to look at things from a different viewpoint, or to notice and name and describe? So these are the key kinds of thinking that your child needs to do in developing their understanding and using that as a tool. And another tool that's useful for us working with our own children or other people's children is being able to ask questions. So you notice on the understanding map, with each of these kinds of thinking, there's a question. And those questions are just meant to kind of be starter questions. There's a whole host of other questions we might ask. So, for example, if we were to take one of those kinds of thinking, the idea of making connections, we could generate a whole host of questions that we could ask. And one of the really valuable things that we do with learners is that when the adult, when the more expert is asking these questions, gradually over time, learners internalize those questions. And they become able to ask themselves those questions. So that's what independence looks like as a learner. Instead of having to rely on someone else to ask you that question and to prompt that, gradually you internalize that. But again, you only internalize that through your exposure from other people, from your adults, from the parents, from the teachers, asking those kinds of questions. So that importance of asking your child questions to begin to unlock their understanding and begin to propel their movement forward. So then the next part there, after we identify the kinds of thinking we value, we have to think about how is it that we make thinking visible. And there are many ways that we can make thinking visible, but a really key strategy that we've developed is this idea of using thinking routines. And those are being used quite extensively here at IVA, and you've probably seen many things come home from your children that involved various thinking routines. We found that the real power of routines is not as activities that get done in the classroom, but as tools that learners use in all kinds of contexts. And just to pick up on one of the routines which you saw mentioned there, this routine See, Think, Wonder, a couple of stories about that. So at the Harvard Medical School, they recognized that one of the biggest challenges for doctors in training was learning to give good clinical diagnoses. So a patient comes in and they only have a few minutes with the patient. They need to observe, they need to recognize things very closely and make good diagnoses on that. Well, they ran an intervention. They allowed some students to sign up on a voluntary basis for a module at the Fine Arts Museum, which in Boston is right next door to the medical school. So for 10 weeks, once a week, these doctors in training went to the museum and they used the routine See, Think, Wonder to look at works of art, to just look closely, to think about what they were seeing, and then to raise questions about that. And after those 10 weeks, those doctors that participated in that module were much improved on their clinical diagnosis skills. Because it's not about looking at art, it's not about where you're doing it, but it's developing that skill to be able to see, be able to think about what you see and interpret that, and being able to raise questions. Another story using that same routine comes from a colleague of mine at Project Zero. And she didn't work on my project or the project developing these routines, but she was familiar with them and had used them in various contexts. And recently, her sister became very ill, and she had to fly across the country to be with her sister and make the medical decisions for her sister. And she was getting very frustrated because she felt like she was not getting the information from the doctors that allowed her to make any decisions and to be able to determine what she should be doing. And all of a sudden, without thinking, she found herself asking the doctors, "Could you just tell me what you're seeing?" And then they began to describe everything that they were seeing with her sister. And I said, "Now what does that make you think?" And then they began to explain their interpretations and their diagnoses of what they were doing. "And now, what are you wondering?" And then they began to explain the complications of what they still didn't know. So the doctors, in that instance, didn't even know that routine, but she found this an incredibly powerful vehicle for communicating with them and talking. And the last story about that routine comes from a 5-year-old in Argentina. And this was a preschool that uses these routines quite extensively. They also use a lot of documentation to make their thinking visible, done a lot of work with parents about using the routines as well. And in this particular household, the parents were getting divorced. And one day the 5-year-old boy came to his mother and said, "I need to talk to you. I want to tell you what I'm seeing." And somehow she kind of sensed that this was an important moment. She got out her cell phone and turned on the recorder and told him that she was going to document this conversation. And he continued, he said, "Well, I see you living in one house, and I see Daddy living in another house. And I see me going back and forth between the two houses. And I think that you're not very happy. And I think Daddy's not very happy. And I wonder, how are we going to be happy again as a family?" So she documented this conversation. They still got divorced, those things happen. But she had documented this conversation because that routine gave that 5-year-old boy a vehicle to begin to talk about his world and what was happening in it, and begin to explain his thinking and make that visible. And they took that conversation to the family therapist and began to work through the issues that they were having to have a more amicable divorce as a result of that. So the important thing about these thinking routines is to recognize that these are really powerful tools for all of us as learners. And although we call them thinking routines, what happens over time is it is the thinking that becomes routine. And so as people get used to noticing, as they get used to interpreting, as they get used to wondering, that kind of thinking becomes embedded and becomes more flexible with their use. So the third part of that 3-part definition, we want to make thinking valued, we want to make it visible. The next thing is we want to make it actively promoted, because we want to make sure that we are advancing students as thinkers, that we are advancing their learning. And the key way that we do that is by creating really powerful learning opportunities. And at the beginning of the year here at IVA, we worked together and talked about what are those qualities that make for really powerful learning opportunities. And we've identified 4 of them from our research that seem to be really important and that seem to be very related to success both in kind of academics as well as long-term engagement with school. And so those 4 qualities, the first one is that we want to engage students in novel applications. So we want them to be involved in applying their skills and knowledge in new context, so that they're forced to be able to transfer what they know, the skills they have, the knowledge, and to do something with that information. The second is a very compatible part of that. We want to make sure that the activities we engage students with also involve a meaningful inquiry, so that students are learning something new, so they aren't only applying their skills and knowledge from the past, but they are also advancing those and learning new things. So one way that we talk about those is that the activities that we engage kids in allow students to both develop as well as to demonstrate their understanding by having both the novel application and the meaningful inquiry. And the third quality is making sure that there's a component of effective communication. That's again where the idea of making the thinking visible is so important, so that students are having to explain their reasoning, to justify, to use the language of the subject area, so learning to communicate their ideas and their thinking effectively. And the last component is the idea of perceived worth, so that students feel that this is valuable, that they aren't just doing work for the teacher, but there is some value in this, they see where the learning is, and that is what kind of motivates them and engage them. And some researchers who have done a lot of work in this area, one man is named Fred Newman, who did a very large study in the Chicago public schools. And basically he was researching and testing this idea is the best way to prepare kids for tests to spend your time in classroom preparing them for tests. And what he did was they looked at, in all the grades that were tested, they collected just the tasks that students were asked to do. So they didn't actually look at the teaching, whether the teaching was good or bad or any quality of that. They just collect what were students asked to do. And what they found was when students were asked to do, had tasks that required these 4 things, their learning went way up. They did much better, even when the tests were just tests of basic skills. And this held true for students of all ability levels, whether they be high ability levels, medium, or low ability levels. And so the message there is the importance of engaging kids in authentic intellectual activity. We want to engage them in real learning and powerful learning that advances them and that moves them forward. So I want to kind of transition now into talking with you about what are some very specific things that you can do kind of as parents. And I've organized this part of the talk, I call it 9 apps for parents. And I've yet to get my nephew to design these apps for me, so these are virtual apps at this moment. You can't actually kind of go on the Apple Store and download these, but you can. That is the correct. If you're interested in the thinking routines, there is a free website. You can just go on there and look, and there are lots of examples up there. So we will just do a virtual run-through of these apps. So this one, N squared, this stands for noticing and naming. So one of the important things that we do as adults to move children forward is we notice and name and highlight the things we want to reinforce. And this is very true of thinking. So a very young child doesn't have to have the language to put forth a hypothesis. What we do is we say, that's an interesting theory you just put forward. That's a great connection. We notice and we name, and that is what gives them the language and the awareness of those strategies. So we also, as adults, we notice and name anything that we want to reinforce. And when we are noticing and naming, then we get more of that same behavior from children. They give it back to us. Not just from children, this works for people in business. What your boss notices and names, you also do more of as well. So it's a way of reinforcing, and it's also a way that we bring new learners into the fold by noticing and naming. And one of the connections here is that we are developing students' strategies for thinking. And this is really important, again, in becoming independent learners. It relates to something that's called meta-strategic knowledge, which means your awareness of the strategies you have. So you don't have to be aware of the strategies to engage in the thinking. So we actually know that very, very young children engage in empathetic responses and show empathy. However, to direct yourself and to tell yourself to be empathetic, you do have to have the language for it. So by noticing and naming, we are developing that awareness, and that helps students to be more metacognitive, more independent learners. So a very simple and important thing that all of us as adults can do. This next one, I imagine you've already heard quite a lot about. This comes from the work of Carol Dweck, who for the past, I think, 35 years has been doing research on what she calls the growth mindset. And when Carol Dweck first started out as a young researcher, she thought what she was interested in how do people deal with failure. And so one of the first things that she did was she put together these puzzles that got increasingly complex. And she would give them to people and give them to students, and they would get harder and harder until they would fail. And then she wanted to find out, how do people deal with that failure? Well, when she first ran this experiment, to her surprise, not everyone failed. It wasn't because they were able to solve the puzzles, because she had made sure that they were going to be way too difficult at some point for people to solve. But it was because when some people couldn't solve the puzzles, they didn't count it as a failure. They actually got excited, and they thought, this is an opportunity to learn. This is an opportunity to get better at solving puzzles. So then she was interested in, well, what makes it so that some people don't take the inability to solve something as a failure? And she discovered it's how people view intelligence, ability, and talent. Do they view it as something that's fixed, either you have it or you don't? or do they view it as something that you grow and you develop over time? And she found that the people who had this growth mindset were those that weren't defeated by failure, but saw that as that opportunity to get smarter. So then, of course, as a researcher, she's interested, well, what is it that causes someone to have a growth mindset? And one of the key things that she found was praise. And as adults, we constantly are praising our children, our students. And she found that when people give praise that is about effort, then those people tend to develop a growth mindset. But when people praise for ability, you're so smart, you're so clever, you're just a born mathematician, that those people actually became less inclined to take challenges and developed a fixed mindset. So back to her puzzle experiments. One of the things she did, again, giving students these puzzles, and students performed exactly the same, but for one group, she would give them praise on their ability, saying, you're so smart, you're just great at solving puzzles, you can really do this well, you're very clever. And the others, they praised on effort. And you worked really hard. You really persevered. You used what you knew from the previous puzzles to solve that one. Now, when you're giving praise for that effort, you're telling people things they can repeat, because you're actually acknowledging, here's all the stuff you can do next time. But when you praise for ability, you're praising the ego. And when you start praising the ego, people then engage in ego protection. So then the next thing she did, after giving these two different kinds of praise, she asked the students, I've got these two stacks of puzzles over here. Now I've got one stack that's kind of easy puzzles. And this other stack over here, they're a little bit more challenging, a little bit more difficult than what we've been doing. In reality, they were the exact same stack. Well, the students that were praised for their ability, you're so smart, you're so clever, had just been told you're a great puzzle solver, were more likely to choose the easy puzzles. Because that's a way to protect your ego. If I choose the easy ones, then I'm going to, of course, be successful at that, and the teacher's still going to think I'm very successful. But the people who were praised for their effort, for what they did, those people chose the more challenging ones. Then they did one last thing on this experiment. They gave the students these puzzles, sent them into a room by themselves. Again, exact same puzzles in either stack. Hidden camera in the room. They said, would you just mark down how you did on all of these puzzles? The students who were praised for their ability, more likely to choose the easy puzzles, then lied on their reports. Because that's another way to protect your ego. So if you didn't really solve it, just lie about that. Whereas again, the people who were praised for their effort were less inclined to lie about that. Now, a newspaper or a news organization in Korea read about this task, and they wondered, is this just kind of a Western thing? And so they repeated this experiment in Korea and found the exact same results. And so the idea of the fixed mindset and the growth mindset and the way we praise as adults seems to be really important for developing that. So every time you have that opportunity to praise your child, think about what they have just done. And again, this is where that noticing and naming comes in, because you can notice and name exactly what they did to be successful. Those are the things they can repeat and redo again, and you can help to develop that sense of a growth mindset. So this next app is also kind of connected with that. It's about the idea of challenge. And so I mentioned before that learning occurs at the point of challenge. So we want all children to get used to the idea that challenge is a good thing and not to kind of run away from it. But one of the tricky things for us as adults is that when children are struggling, we want to be helpful. And it's very easy for us as adults to whoop in and rescue them. Here's how you do it. Let me help you. Let me solve that. And again, when you rescue someone, you actually make them more dependent in the future on being rescued and less inclined to take their own initiative. And the easiest way that you can know in any instance whether you are rescuing or whether you are supporting initiative is just to ask yourself in any instance, who's doing the thinking? So if you're the one doing the thinking, you're rescuing. if you're asking questions to encourage your child to do their own thinking and to think through the things. Supporting initiative doesn't mean being unhelpful. It just means you make sure you're not doing the thinking and solving it for your child, but you are asking those questions. So again, that important role of asking those questions, asking them about making connections, asking them about their evidence, their reasoning, asking them to think through things to support that idea of them developing initiative. The next one here, we've talked quite a lot about questions already and the importance and power of questions, but the story I want to tell you here is about a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. His name is Isidore Rabi. And when Isidore Rabi won the Nobel Prize for Physics, the New York Times sent a reporter to interview him, as you would if you win the Nobel Prize for Physics. And one of the questions the reporter asked him was, how in the world did you become a Nobel Prize-winning physicist? You grew up in an immigrant household. You grew up on a street in which none of your neighbors were scientists. You didn't know a scientist growing up. Your parents weren't scientists. So how in the world did you become a scientist? And he said, that's easy. He said, every day when all the other kids went home from school, their mothers would ask them, what'd you do in school today? But when I came home from school, my mother asked me, Izzy, did you ask any good questions today? That is what made me a scientist. So encouraging your child's curiosity, encouraging them asking their own questions, that the curiosity is what propels us as learners, and recognizing how important that is to develop that sense of curiosity. This next app deals with the tension between work and learning. And the difference here when we're talking about work and learning is largely one of intent and purpose. And there's a long, long line of research. One of the most actually strongest research findings consistently is that when learners understand the purpose behind what they're doing and see it as meaningful, learning goes way up. And when people do things just as work, just to get it done, then they may miss a lot of the learning that's happening. And as teachers, we never set out to just give kids work. We always think that there's an intent behind that, but sometimes that intent gets lost. And as parents, one of the roles you can find yourself in is being monitors of the work. Your child comes home and the first question you ask is, well, what's your homework? What do you have to do? Let me see it. Are you done? Let me check your homework. And you can still do that, but I would encourage you to do one additional question in between. So in addition to asking, well, what's your homework? And they tell you, ask them, and what is it you think your teacher wants you to learn from doing that? That's refocusing them on the intent, on the purpose, to make sure that purpose and intent doesn't get lost, rather than just doing it as mere kind of work completion. And the next step here, I'm going to encourage you to let your children argue with you. And in many households, I know that's not a problem. But the thing I want to say about the arguing here is this has to be arguing about presenting evidence and constructing an argument, and doing that in a respectful and persuasive way. And the research behind this came out a couple of years ago. It was in the Journal of Adolescence, and they were looking at what were the qualities, the things that made adolescents more susceptible to peer pressure and more inclined to use drugs and get involved with drugs and negative behavior. And what they found was children that come from households in which they were encouraged and supported in developing persuasive arguments were more resilient when peer pressure was to do something negative. That those children were actually able to take something from the home and transfer it into the peer culture, that then when their peers said, let's do this, they could develop an argument and say, no, let's not do that, let's do this instead, here's why we shouldn't do that. Conversely, the children that came from more dogmatic households where they were just told, no argument, that's it, I don't want to hear about it, were actually more susceptible to peer pressure because they didn't have the skills then to combat other people's ideas. So learning to develop persuasive arguments to reasons, you as the parent are still the decider. Just because your child puts forth an argument doesn't mean you have to say yes to it. You can say, that's crummy evidence. That's not very persuasive. I'm not convinced. You're still making that. But at least you hear them out. that you encourage them to do that and support that. And then the next time they come back with a better argument and a more convincing thing. So that importance of developing those skills in the household, very important. The next one here is the importance of time. And this is coming out more and more in many different contexts about the importance actually of unstructured time. The unstructured time is one of the places where children begin to develop the ability to be self-directed. That when all of their time is directed and controlled for them, they don't learn to make decisions about how to allocate their time and what to do with their time. So having unstructured time to play and to make decisions on their own and to make their choices is really important to developing that sense of being a self-directed learner. And part of that means, the undirected time also means time away from a computer screen. That there's, again, a lot of research coming out about the way that the mind works when it is being interrupted constantly by social media and other constraints that we actually aren't processing the same way when we do that. So it's not that you need to ban that altogether, but what we need to help students learn to do is to take intervals. So you can take breaks. You can work, you can study for, you want to constantly develop that time, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then you take a social media break, a technology break, and you engage in that. But allowing us to focus is really important in having that time. And having unstructured time is also the place where young people develop their interest and their passions. And so finding that time and making sure that we give protected time to our children. The next one here is, I want to encourage you to make your own thinking visible. Back to that quote from Vygotsky, the idea that children grow into the intellectual life around them. So making your own thinking visible, to talk through so that your child sees your curiosity. How is it that you reflect on your decisions? How is it that you learn from your mistakes? So making your own thinking visible becomes a model for your child of their potential thinking and where they can go. And the last app here, this acronym stands for What Makes You Say That? So this is one of our thinking routines. And when we first developed this, we were working in Sweden, and the Swedish teachers took to calling this the magic question. Because they said, as soon as we ask, well, what makes you say that? All of a sudden, we get so much more from our students. And then in Australia, one of the teachers we were working with, she said, oh, that what makes you say that? She said, oh, that's not just for the class. She said, that's how I live my life now. She said, I used to be really shy at cocktail parties. And then I found, if you just listen and ask, well, what makes you say that? All of a sudden, people think you're really smart, and the conversation just continues. And she said, and I used to get really angry. My husband would say the stupidest things. And then I just learned to take a breath and say, well, what makes you say that? And then his reasons were totally different from what I expected. So she found that really, really powerful. The one caveat I would say is that when you start using what makes you say that, don't be surprised if your children start using it back on you. Because that's one of the things about routines and about making our thinking visible is that it goes both ways. So hopefully tonight you've gotten some ideas, some strategies, and again, those 9 apps we've got together on the sheets to help you kind of remember those strategies for you. But using these strategies, we can really work together to help make children powerful thinkers and learners. So thank you.